All right. And then we go into the next section, which is Jesus heals the sick, which again seems pretty straightforward as far as information. But you point out the one thing that may not be understood as far as synagogues and the role they played in the culture and the significance that it was that Jesus was going and doing this.
Yes. Synagogues are something that we have a little bit more difficulty understanding. It's not something we have per se. The closest we get is the local church, wherever you attend church. But in this culture, in this time, synagogues were established particularly in the far-flung reaches of the empire. That's where they were developed for. If you lived in Israel, the synagogue was not as important as it was if you lived in Crete. Because in Crete, there might be only 100 Jews, and you might be settled all over the city. Well, you had to have some way to connect with them in worship and in ministry, and encouraging each other. And so they created synagogues, and they had to have a certain number of Jewish men in order to found a synagogue. I believe it was 10. I would have to verify that. But it was the center of worship. It was the center of education for the Jews. It was their connection to their faith and to their lifestyle. It was what helped them keep from straying aside to the Greek and the Roman ways of life, and trying to stick with what God had asked of them. And so it was the church in a sense, but it was also more. It was what sort of helped keep them separate from the world in a way. But yet, because in Israel they found that it was helpful for teaching and for educating, they introduced these throughout Israel as well, in addition to the other parts of the empire. And so, there's one in Capernaum, there's one in Nazareth, there's going to be one in Bethsaida. Any town that has a decent sized population will have one or multiple synagogues where they can go and they can hear the readings of the scriptures on the Sabbath, and they can, that's where they're going to send their boys to get trained from up to 13 years old to memorize the scriptures. And it's where they're going to keep records of the who's descended from whom. All these things are going to happen in the synagogue. It's going to be sort of that center of the community. And every Sabbath they would go there, and somebody would read the scrolls. So either the leader of the synagogue or someone who's appointed by him, or if there was a visiting teacher, they would often be given the honor of reading the scroll and teaching, because it was, a guest speaker in a way. And so this is how Jesus often gets the opportunity to preach in the synagogues, is because as a traveling rabbi, as a teacher, they would show him respect until he really began to have these conflicts with the Pharisees, where they hate him and try to run him out of everywhere. He goes into these synagogues, and he's given that same level of respect as the other teachers, and the opportunity to preach and teach.
One of your reflection questions at the end of the chapter here, the first one, when you are seeking God, when should you stop seeking? Why did you ask that question?
I'm referencing back to Jesus in the wilderness, because I talked about how he was seeking God for 40 days and he was still waiting. And that's sort of a bit of the element of the temptations is, well, God hasn't answered yet. Why don't you go do this, and, we'll get back to God later. And Jesus is refusing to eat, refusing to do other things until he gets that direction from God.
Okay.
And I say that because there's often times where in our Christian life where we're wanting answers from God, where we're seeking God for something, and whether we've spent 40, we don't often have to take that amount of time to separate and to fast for 40 days. But there's times where we need to pray over it and just continue to seek God and come back and pray over it again and pray over it again until we get that answer from God, rather than just waiting like, well, I haven't heard from God, I might as well make my own decision on this. Sometimes when you're seeking God like that, you need to stick it out and you need to continue going until you hear from God and get that direction.
And isn't it also true that sometimes we hear from God, but God's saying no, and we're still seeking for a yes?
Oh, yeah, definitely. We do this a lot. God says no, or he just tells us, wait, like, come back to me later on this. And we're like, but I want to have an answer now. But yeah, we have to be willing to hear what God's answer is, whether we like it or not. It's not just waiting for God to do what we want, it's waiting for God to give us the answer. And then we go out and do what he said.